Hello there, guys. Welcome to today's live. Hello there, guys. Welcome to today's live. So today's topic uh, is vector addition. Okay, so welcome to today's stream, guys. So today I have this strong coffee made for me, and because today I could not sleep at daytime, I could not do my afternoon, not afternoon, like after the noon sleep. That's why I am feeling kind of a headache, and that's why I have this strong coffee my mother made me. And today we have a huge task. Today we need to, as today is Thursday, I have gap. Friday and Saturday is the weekend in Qatar. That's why I will, what do you call? That's why I will. How do you want to say it? I cannot even think straight what to talk because I'm having a great headache. So for the thing is, for the last week, I did not study properly. From yesterday again I started to study, so that's why I have a huge lacking in my studies for a week, almost a week. That's why what I will try to do today is I will try to cope up with the work, cope up with my school and my teachers. So first subject we'll be studying is physics. The physics, we are going to talk about vectors now. uh, we are actually learning about vector multiplication, but as I did not study vector in general, so I will like just go through the textbook, the reference textbook, and and give a revision for all the types of addition, subtraction, like all the types of vector arithmetics. And after that we will start the physics second paper. The vector one is on physics first paper, and also we have one test on Sunday on physics second paper. That's why we will I will take some preparation also. Anyway, so I will not waste much time. Oh, and also after like completing the vector chapter, I will go for physics second paper, thermodynamics, because thermodynamics, I have some real huge problem with thermodynamics. And also one thing that now that I've started the stream, uh we had one debate competition today and we won, so that's a good thing, I guess. And I always like to start with good, because why not? if someone wants to know what reference I'm watching, I'm seeing, then you can check the link I shared in the chat. The problem with the vector is I am not sure about the direction about vector yet, because here it says that angle at which the vector is inclined. Angle with what? What is the reference frame here? Like, you can't just say angle is the direction of the vector is angle, but for a vector to have an angle, you need a reference frame. But what is the reference frame here? Too much confusing. Sherry, Sherry. It's gonna buy one candle. That is some little crazy pretty baby, better promise more. Hush little baby, don't you cry, it's gonna be a story. Daddy's gonna hold you through the night. If you ever feel so. Stick them and light up a little lady. I told you there was no The magnitude of a vector shown by vertical lines on both the sides. I think this guide by Byju's on vectors is a really great one. It is a summation and a quick summary of my whole book, of my whole chapter in my book. And also the language used here is far more understandable than my book. Actually, my book is clearly gibberish. But it also may be a case that as I already have like a primary idea about vectors, that's why maybe this vector tutorial from Byju's is looking kind of easier for me to understand. But as of with the book, I it was the first time I was actually learning about vector. Maybe that's why it sounded so gibberish. There is a kind of paradox, like sometimes when no, I cannot form even a thought straight up because that's how much my head is hurting. My whole world is literally rotating for some reason. I'm having nausea. Maybe if it goes like this, I won't be able to do the stream for 5 hours straight. Yes, sir. You see, this opposite vector concept is really confusing to me. scalar multiplication.
Suppose we have two arrows. Let's define the cross product of these two arrows to be a third arrow. The arrow representing the cross product is always exactly 90 degrees to the two original arrows. The length of the arrow representing the cross product is always exactly equal to the area of the parallelogram that is formed by the original two arrows. The cross product of two arrows plays a critical role in many areas of science and engineering. Another type of calculation that plays a critical role is what we refer to as the dot product of two arrows. The first arrow defines a line. This line and the second arrow form a triangle. Consider the length of this side of the triangle. Now, consider this length multiplied by the length of the first arrow. The result of this multiplication is what we refer to as the dot product. If the first arrow and the red arrow are pointed in opposite directions, then the dot product is negative. Whereas the cross product of two arrows is another arrow, the dot product of two arrows is just a number. Whenever we take the dot product of two arrows, we will always get the same answer regardless of
Last video, I talked about the dot product, showing both the standard introduction to the topic, as well as a deeper view of how it relates to linear transformations. I'd like to do the same thing for cross products. Last video, I talked Traditionally, dot products are something that's introduced really early on in a linear algebra course, typically right at the start, so it might seem strange that I've pushed them back this far in the series. I did this because there's a standard way to introduce the topic, which requires nothing more than a basic understanding of vectors.
Okay, so boys, there is a change in plan. Now we will watch this whole series on linear algebra only to understand what vector is. So grab onto your coffee and your notebook because we are going to dig deep into linear algebra.
The fundamental, root of it all building block for linear algebra is the vector. So it's worth making sure that we're all on the same page about what exactly a vector is. You see, broadly speaking, there are three distinct but related ideas about vectors, which I'll call the physics student perspective, the computer science student perspective, and the mathematician's perspective. The physics student perspective is that vectors are arrows pointing in space. What defines a given vector is its length and the direction it's pointing. But as long as those two facts are the same, you can move it all around and it's still the same vector. Vectors that live in the flat plane are two-dimensional, and those sitting in broader space that you and I live in are three-dimensional. The computer science perspective is that vectors are ordered lists of numbers. For example, let's say you were doing some analytics about house prices, and the only features you cared about were square footage and price. You might model each house with a pair of numbers, the first indicating square footage and the second indicating price. Notice, the order matters here. In the lingo, you'd be modeling houses as two-dimensional vectors, where in this context, vector is pretty much just a fancy word for list, and what makes it two-dimensional is the fact that the length of that list is 2. The mathematician, on the other hand, seeks to generalize both these views, basically saying that a vector can be anything where there's a sensible notion of adding two vectors and multiplying a vector by a number, operations that I'll talk about later on in this video. The details of this view are rather abstract, and I actually think it's healthy to ignore it until the last video of this series, favoring a more concrete setting in the interim. But the reason I bring it up here is that it hints at the fact that the ideas of vector addition and multiplication by numbers will play an important role throughout linear algebra. But before I talk about those operations, let's just settle in on a specific thought to have in mind when I say the word vector. Given the geometric focus that I'm shooting for here, whenever I introduce a new topic involving vectors, I want you to first think about an arrow, and specifically, think about that arrow inside a coordinate system, like the xy plane, with its tail sitting at the origin. This is a little bit different from the physics student perspective, where vectors can freely sit anywhere they want in space. In linear algebra, it's almost always the case that your vector will be rooted at the origin. Then, once you understand a new concept in the context of arrows in space, we'll translate it over to the list of numbers point of view, which we can do by considering the coordinates of the vector. Now, while I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with this coordinate system, it's worth walking through explicitly, since this is where all of the important back and forth happens between the two perspectives of linear algebra. Focusing our attention on two dimensions for the moment, you have a horizontal line, favoring a more concrete setting in the interim. But the reason I bring it up here is that it hints at the fact that the ideas of vector addition and multiplication by numbers will play an important role throughout linear algebra. But before I talk about those operations, let's just settle in on a specific thought to have in mind when I say the word vector. Given the geometric focus that I'm shooting for here, whenever I introduce a new topic involving vectors, I want you to first think about an arrow, and specifically, think about that arrow inside a coordinate system, like the xy plane, with its tail sitting at the origin. This is a little bit different from the physics student perspective, where vectors can freely sit anywhere they want in space. In linear algebra, it's almost always the case that your vector will be rooted at the origin. Then, once you understand a new concept in the context of arrows in space, we'll translate it over to the list of numbers point of view, which we can do by considering the coordinates of the vector. Now, while I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with this coordinate system, it's worth walking through explicitly, since this is where all of the important back and forth happens between the two perspectives of linear algebra. Focusing our attention on two dimensions for the moment, you have a horizontal line, called the x-axis, and a vertical line, called the y-axis. The place where they intersect is called the origin, which you should think of as the center of space and the root of all vectors. After choosing an arbitrary length to represent 1, you make tick marks on each axis to represent this distance. When I want to convey the idea of 2D space as a whole, which you'll see comes up a lot in these videos, I'll extend these tick marks to make grid lines, but right now they'll actually get a little bit in the way. The coordinate length to represent 1, you make tick marks on each axis to represent this distance. When I want to convey the idea of 2D space as a whole, which you'll see comes up a lot in these videos, I'll extend these tick marks to make grid lines, but right now they'll actually get a little bit in the way. The coordinates of a vector is a pair of numbers that basically gives instructions for how to get from the tail of that vector at the origin to its tip. The first number tells you how far to walk along the x-axis, positive numbers indicating right.
You see, that's what I was thinking about, that a vector is nothing but it just shows you how to get to a point. It just shows you the distance, the location of a point in reference to the origin or in reference to a reference body. But that's where the confusion starts, because in physics, as we are learning, there is no freaking reference, there is no freaking origin or nothing. It's just a vector. Vector is a vector. Too much confusing. Like, they are not putting the vector in a grid, they are not putting the vector in a coordinate system, and that's why. And the problem is, I was thinking like this video, I was thinking that a vector is basically constrained in a coordinate system, most probably in the Cartesian system, but some reality is quite confusing.
Rightward motion, negative numbers indicating leftward motion, and the second number tells you how far to walk parallel to the y-axis after that, positive numbers indicating upward motion, and negative numbers indicating downward motion. To distinguish vectors from points, the convention is to write this pair of numbers vertically, with square brackets around them. Every pair of numbers gives you one and only one vector, and every vector is associated with one and only one pair of numbers. What about in 3 dimensions? Well, you add a third axis, called the z-axis, which is perpendicular to both the x and y axes, and in this case, each vector is associated with an ordered triplet of numbers. The first tells you how far to move along the x-axis, the second tells you how far to move parallel to the y-axis, and the third one tells you how far to then move parallel to this new z-axis. Every triplet of numbers gives you one unique vector in space, and every vector in space gives you exactly one triplet of numbers. Alright, so back to vector addition and multiplication by numbers. After all, every topic in linear algebra is going to center around these two operations. Luckily, each one's pretty straightforward to define. Let's say we have 2 vectors, one pointing up and a little to the right, and the other one pointing right and down a bit. To add these 2 vectors, move the second one so that its tail sits at the tip of the first one. Then, if you draw a new vector from the tail of the first one to where the tip of the second one now sits, that new vector is their sum. Up and a little to the right, and the other one pointing right and down a bit. To add these 2 vectors, move the second one so that its tail sits at the tip of the first one. Then, if you draw a new vector from the tail of the first one to where the tip of the second one now sits, that new vector is their sum. This definition of addition, by the way, is pretty much the only time in linear algebra where we let vectors stray away from the origin. Now, why is this a reasonable thing to do? Why this definition of addition and not some other one? Well, the way I like to think about it is that each vector represents a certain movement, a step with a certain distance and direction in space. If you take a step along the first vector, then take a step in the direction and distance described by the second vector, the overall effect is just the same as if you moved along the sum of those 2 vectors to start with. You could think about this as an extension of how we think about adding numbers on a number line. One way that we teach kids to think about this, say with 2 plus 5, is to think of moving 2 steps to the right, followed by another 5 steps to the right. The overall effect is the same as if you just took 7 steps to the right. In fact, let's see how vector addition looks numerically. The first vector here has coordinates 1, 2. And the second one has coordinates 3, -1. When you take the vector sum using this tip-to-tail method, you can think of a 4-step path from the origin to the tip of the second vector. Walk 1 to the right, then 2 up, then 3 to the right, then 1 down. Reorganizing these steps, 2. Addition looks numerically. The first vector here has coordinates 1, 2, and the second one has coordinates 3, -1. When you take the vector sum using this tip-to-tail method, you can think of a 4-step path from the origin to the tip of the second vector. Walk 1 to the right, then 2 up, then 3 to the right, then 1 down. Reorganizing these steps so that you first do all of the rightward motion, then do all the vertical motion, you can read it as saying, first move 1 plus 3 to the right, then move 2 minus 1 up. So the new vector has coordinates 1 plus 3 and 2 plus -1. In general, vector addition in this list of numbers conception looks like matching up their terms and adding each one together. The other fundamental vector operation is multiplication by a number. Now this is best understood just by looking at a few examples. If you take the number 2 and multiply it by a given vector, it means you stretch out that vector so that it's 2 times as long as when you started. If you multiply that vector by, say, 1/3, it means you squish it down so that it's 1/3 the original length. When you multiply it by a negative number, like -1.8, then the vector first gets flipped around, then stretched out by that factor of 1.8. This process of stretching or squishing or sometimes reversing the direction of a vector is called scaling. And whenever you catch a number, like 2 or 1/3 or -1.8, acting like this, scaling some vector, you call it a scalar. In fact, throughout linear algebra, one of the main things that numbers do is scale vectors, so it's common to use the word scalar pretty much interchangeably with the word number. Numerically, stretching out a vector by a factor of, say, 2, corresponds with multiplying each of its components by that factor, 2. So in the conception of vectors as lists of numbers, multiplying a given vector by a scalar means multiplying each one of those components by that scalar. You'll see in the following videos what I mean when I say that linear algebra topics tend to revolve around these two fundamental operations, vector addition and scalar multiplication. And I'll talk more in the last video about how and why the mathematician thinks only about these operations, independent and abstracted away from however you choose to represent vectors. In truth, it doesn't matter whether you think about vectors as fundamentally being arrows in space, like I'm suggesting you do, that happen to have a nice numerical representation, or fundamentally as lists of numbers that happen to have a nice geometric interpretation. The usefulness of linear algebra has less to do with either one of these views than it does with the ability to translate back and forth between them. It gives the data analyst a nice way to conceptualize many lists of numbers in a visual way, which can seriously clarify patterns in data and give a global view of what certain operations do. And on the flip side, it gives people like physicists and computer graphics programmers a language to describe space and the manipulation of space using numbers that can be crunched and run through a computer. When I do mathy animations, for example, I start by thinking about what's actually going on in space and then get the computer to represent things numerically, thereby figuring out where to place the pixels on the screen. And doing that usually relies on a lot of linear algebra understanding. So there are your vector basics, and in the next video, I'll start getting into some pretty neat concepts surrounding vectors, like span, bases, and linear dependence. See you then!
Okay, so guys, this three blue and one brown channel. Actually, I knew this channel from a long time before, but huge shout out to this channel because this creator literally made his own Python library for making these cool animations, and it's called Manim, if I remember correctly, math animation, Manime or Manimation, something like that. So And also he is a great teacher. In my opinion, he is, if not the greatest teacher of mathematics in YouTube, because he can explain stuff so simply, with interactive, what do you call interactive, what the hell, I can't even form a thought straight, because that's how sleepy I feel. But I will complete this whole lecture, whole playlist, and then go to sleep, and probably end this live stream before schedule, because I can't continue. I need sleep, or else I might fall apart literally.
In the last video, along with the ideas of vector addition and scalar multiplication, I described vector coordinates, where there's this back and forth between, for example, pairs of numbers and two-dimensional vectors. Now, I imagine the vector coordinates were already familiar to a lot of you, but there's another kind of interesting way to think about these coordinates, which is pretty central to linear algebra. When you have a pair of numbers that's meant to describe a vector, like 3, -2, I want you to think about each coordinate as a scalar, meaning think about how each one stretches or squishes vectors. In the xy coordinate system, there are two very special vectors. The one pointing to the right with length 1, commonly called I hat, or the unit vector in the x direction, and the one pointing straight up with length 1, commonly called j hat, or the unit vector in the y direction. Now, think of the x-coordinate of our vector as a scalar that scales I hat, stretching it by a factor of 3, and the y-coordinate as a scalar that scales j hat, flipping it and stretching it by a factor of 2. In this sense, the vector that these coordinates describe is the sum of two scaled vectors. That's a surprisingly important concept, this idea of adding together two scaled vectors. Those two vectors, I hat and j hat, have a special name, by the way. Together, they're called the basis of a coordinate system. What this means, basically, is that when you think about coordinates as scalars, the basis vectors are what those scalars actually, scale. There's also a more technical definition, but I'll get to that later. By framing our coordinate system in terms of these two special basis vectors, it raises a pretty interesting and subtle point. We could have chosen different basis vectors and gotten a completely reasonable, new coordinate system. For example, take some vector pointing up and to the right, along with some other vector pointing down and to the right in some way. Take a moment to think about all the different vectors that you can get by choosing two scalars, using each one to scale one of the vectors, then adding together what you get. Which two-dimensional vectors can you reach by altering the choices of scalars? The answer is that you can reach every possible two-dimensional vector, and I think it's a good puzzle to contemplate why. A new pair of basis vectors like this still gives us a valid way to go back and forth between pairs of numbers and two-dimensional vectors, but the association is definitely different from the one that you get using the more standard basis of I hat and j hat. This is something I'll go into much more detail on later, describing the exact relationship between different coordinate systems. But for right now, I just want you to appreciate the fact that anytime we describe vectors numerically, it depends on an implicit choice of what basis vectors we're using. So anytime that you're scaling two vectors and adding them like this, it's called a linear combination of those two vectors. Where does this word linear come from? Why does this have anything to do with lines? Well, this isn't the etymology, but one way I like to think about it is that if you fix one of those scalars and let the other one change its value freely, the tip of the resulting vector draws a straight line. Now, if you let both scalars range freely and consider every possible vector that you can get, there are two things that can happen. For most pairs of vectors, you'll be able to reach every possible point in the plane. Every two-dimensional vector is within your grasp. However, in the unlucky case where your two original vectors happen to line up, the tip of the resulting vector is limited to just this single line passing through the origin. Actually, technically there's a third possibility too. Both your vectors could be 0, in which case you'd just be stuck at the origin. Here's some more terminology. The set of all possible vectors that you can reach with a linear combination of a given pair of vectors is called the span of those two vectors. So restating what we just saw in this lingo, the span of most pairs of 2D vectors is all vectors of 2D space. But when they line up, their span is all vectors whose tip sit on a certain line. Remember how I said that linear algebra revolves around vector addition and scalar multiplication? Well, the span of two vectors is basically a way of asking what are all the possible vectors you can reach using only these two fundamental operations, vector addition and scalar multiplication. This is a good time to talk about how people commonly think about vectors as points. It gets really crowded to think about a whole collection of vectors sitting on a line, and more crowded still to think about all two-dimensional vectors all at once, filling up the plane. So when dealing with collections of vectors like this, it's common to represent each one with just a point in space. The point at the tip of that vector where, as usual, I want you thinking about that vector with its tail on the origin. That way, if you want to think about every possible vector whose tip sits on a certain line, just think about the line itself. Likewise, to think about all possible two-dimensional vectors all at once, conceptualize each one as the point where its tip sits. So in effect, what you'll be thinking about is the infinite flat sheet of two-dimensional space itself, leaving the arrows out of it. In general, if you're thinking about a vector on its own, think of it as an arrow. And if you're dealing with a collection of vectors, it's convenient to think of them all as points. So for our span example, the span of most pairs of vectors ends up being the entire infinite sheet of two-dimensional space. But if they line up, their span is just a line. The idea of span gets a lot more interesting if we start thinking about vectors in three-dimensional space. For example, if you take two vectors in 3D space that are not pointing in the same direction, what does it mean to take their span? Well, their span is the collection of all possible linear combinations of those two vectors, meaning all possible vectors you get by scaling each of the two of them in some way and then adding them together. You can kind of imagine turning two different knobs to change the two scalars defining the linear combination, adding the scaled vectors and following the tip of the resulting vector. That tip will trace out some kind of flat sheet cutting through the origin of three-dimensional space. This flat sheet is the span of the two vectors. Or more precisely, the set of all possible vectors whose tips sit on that flat sheet is the span of your two vectors. Isn't that a beautiful mental image? So what happens if we add a third vector and consider the span of all three of those guys? A linear combination.
Yeah, I have enough. The urge to sleep is too much. Even coffee cannot fix that. So I am going to sleep now. I don't care about this live stream. Throw it out the window. I was supposed to study for 5 hours. You know what? I have 2 days gap, so there is no problem if I take a small gap for one day. That's just the beginning of a downfall in study. Anyway, so I will I will again start I will again uh go live. I will again go live like around after Maghrib maybe. And that time I will continue watching that series of vector and linear algebra, because you can literally see my eyes. I even though I drank this cup of coffee, my whole eyes are like shutting down. My whole system is collapsing, and that's why I am ending this stream only at minute 47, because I cannot continue like this. So see you after Maghrib.